Welcome to the OnScript podcast, your home for world-class conversations on scripture and theology, where you get to meet some of the best in the field. Visit us at onscript.study. Say hello on Twitter at OnScriptPodcast and stop by our Facebook page at facebook.com/OnScript.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the OnScript podcast. This is Matt Lynch coming to you from Regent College in Vancouver. Thanks so much for tuning in. In this episode, you're going to hear an interview I did with Amy Cottrill about her book, Uncovering Violence, Reading Biblical Narratives as an Ethical Project. It was a super fascinating book and one I highly recommend. So hope you enjoy our conversation. And Amy and I are both graduates of Emory, so it's nice to connect with someone who graduated a bit ahead of me. But we share a lot of the same interests and have studied with a lot of the same people, which is pretty cool. So also, if you had not heard in earlier episodes, we're looking for a new producer. Ed Hatkey, who has been faithfully producing this show for 5 years, is going to be retiring from OnScript, and we're so grateful to him for all that he's done over the years, and we're looking for someone that could volunteer to help us with that, or if you just want to touch base with us, have ideas or thoughts, we'd welcome that. You can email onscriptpodcast@gmail.com to follow up. All right, without further ado, enjoy this episode. Hey everyone, our guest today is Dr. Amy Cottrill, Denson N. Franklin Professor of Religion at Birmingham-Southern College. She's the author of Language, Power, and Identity in the Lament Psalms of the Individual, and most recently, the book we'll be discussing today, Uncovering Violence, Reading Biblical Narratives as an Ethical Project. Amy, welcome to OnScript.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yes, I'm wondering, just to start out, if you could talk about some of the formative experiences that drew you into this field of biblical studies, and maybe in particular the subject of violence.
Yes, thank you. Well, I really think that my interest in biblical studies started quite early in my household. We were kind of text-based folks. My father's a Methodist minister, and my mother was is now a retired high school English teacher, and so there's a lot of attention to text and language. And I think I went to college at a little Quaker school in Richmond, Indiana, Earlham College, and I majored in English, but had a heavy interest in religion. And then I decided to go to seminary. I didn't know what was going to become of that, but my first semester there, I took Hebrew with David Carr, who's now at Union, and it was just one of those kind of transformative educational moments. I just really fell in love with studying Hebrew. It just felt like I had access to the potential of the text in a new way. I really enjoyed David Carr's approach, and it just became a kind of a passion, really. So then I was fortunate enough to go to Emory and study with Carol Newsom, and things have just sort of taken shape from there.
Yeah, so you mentioned David Carr and Carol Newsom. Would you say they're two of the formative people in terms of professors you've had along the way? I know that we hate to leave people out, but I'm just thinking.
I do hate to leave people out, but I did mention both of those people, and I do think that they are. I mean, particularly in the what I do now in terms of the study of violence, I think they are both really important in the way that I approach this work. David Carr's work on trauma, holy resilience especially, was a really important book for me. And then Carol Newsom's study of selfhood, which she's been engaging in that conversation for a while. That was really important in my in my dissertation work on the Psalms, on the laments of the individual, and thinking about who the I of the laments is. What are the various kind of cultural and linguistic influences that come together to form that I, that linguistic I. And, that's really where I started to think about violence was in the study of the laments. I started to think about, I started reading and, studying those in my dissertation, and realized that I had not been accurately or adequately prepared for the level of violence that is in the Lament Psalms. And I was kind of shocked by that. Wasn't expecting it. And I started to just think about what does it mean when people kind of step into the world of the laments and take on the language of the I, when they pray that language, when you pray for the destruction of your enemies and, kind of pray that with some sincerity, what happens to the individual? What are the implications of that? So I started playing around with that question, and I think I did a little bit of work with that with Psalms and violence, but because of teaching obligations and teaching opportunities here, I pretty quickly went into narrative as a way to address issues of violence and the formation of the reader.
So that ties into a question I had when I finished your book, which was, all right, you've done this book on narrative and violence. How does this work with other genres? And maybe we could come back to that. But it sounds like you had already been there, having done poetic prayers of lament. So you mentioned in the beginning of the book that this comes out of a class that you taught called Violence in the Bible, which I'm sure was interesting, and it's a good title for a class. Draws people in, something a lot of students want to wrestle with. And I would imagine a fair number of your students come from a faith background of some kind, or at least have cultural exposure to the Bible. And so what are some of the assumptions that they bring into the classroom, or misconceptions that you about the Bible and violence that you address?
Yeah, and I try to think about that. I mean, teaching obviously is one of the primary ways. I mean, Birmingham-Southern is a teaching school. I spend a lot of time with students and in the classroom, and that has been a major formation in the way that I think about the Bible, for sure, the way my scholarship has unfolded. And in this class, I think that a lot of people come into the class because they think of violence as something that they don't like it. They want to avoid it. They want to reduce the levels of violence that are in the world. And I think they come with that sort of interest. They also do come from mostly Christian backgrounds. And I think that, I pretty quickly encounter the assumption that I think probably all scholars of the Hebrew Bible do in the United States, at least, that the New Testament sort of corrects, offers a peaceful alternative to an improvement upon the violence of the Hebrew Bible, and that the class will mostly be about the Hebrew Bible, I think is an assumption that, violence really doesn't occur in the New Testament. This is a Hebrew Bible problem to be solved. and that, that's the kind of basic assumption. And that violence, the class will be about warfare, is also one of the major assumptions, that we're going to talk about the war texts. And so, so those are some of the initial assumptions that I think they have. But there are other, there's another assumption that I have often observed as well, which is that I think people assume that they're going to be able to be in this class and kind of learn lessons for life, right? That they will be able to read the text and then kind of be able to articulate the moral of the story, right, with regard to violence, and be able to kind of pull that out, extract it, and apply it to their lives. And that the Bible offers those moral lessons for living. Yeah. So I think those are some of the assumptions. Yeah.
Yeah. So part of what you're doing in the book is saying that something else can happen as we read violent stories. So maybe it would help if you could explain your view on what happens or can happen to readers as they read violence in the Bible.
And this is sort of the more complicated, I think, and more difficult parts of the text for my students to kind of wrestle with in the when we talk about this is that reading is not just an intellectual process, right? This is kind of the idea that I'm trying to introduce. It's not that readers are embodied, and that we start our interpretive process long before we kind of rationally understand what we have read, and that making meaning out of a text isn't just a cerebral, intellectual process. So I'm interested in the ways that violence works on people before we even are kind of aware of it, before we're conscious of it, the way that we have reactions, the way that we are affectively influenced by the words, by the people that we encounter, by the words on the page, and how that creates the context in which our thinking happens. So I guess I'm trying to kind of undermine this idea, this very popular, Western notion of this, the mind-body dualism that we tend to function with. And I'm trying to say, let's read as embodied people and give attention to that process as part of meaning making, as part of interpretation.
And is that what it means to read the Bible as an ethical project, which is your subtitle is Reading Biblical Narratives as an Ethical Project?
Yeah, definitely is. That's definitely part of the main idea, is that reading is not something that is reading violence and thinking about it in terms of ethics is not a project that can ever be finalized, right? We're part of an ongoing relational dialogue that is constantly unfolding. And the goals of this are not to solve a problem, which I think is sometimes an assumption about ethics that, at least for many of my students, is that ethics will provide a solution to a problem. And I think there are certainly better ways of thinking about violence than others, but the goal is not to sort of come to a conclusion. The goal is to be able to perceive more and be more self-aware of our reactions, and more aware of the gaps, the silences, the intricacies of the text as well.
You really bring that out. I'm thinking particularly of your example with Judges 5, which we'll talk about in a moment. But as you're talking, I'm hearing the connection to your previous work on lament, in that you're asking the question in both situations, who does the reader become as they engage this text? So who do they become as they pray the I in the Psalms? Because it's a self-investing kind of language where you're reading something and then suddenly you're saying I and uttering, violent prayers, which is, you're almost caught as a reader then as you read these things. You can't stay at arm's length. And then on the narrative side, I don't know if this is the right way to put it, but you use the term witness. You're a witness to violence. And that does work on you as a reader. And so attending to that, is that kind of what you're up to then?
Yes. Yeah. And I started noticing this again as a teacher when we would be in the classroom talking about stories. And it often happened in the context of Judges 19, the rape of the Levite's concubine. There would be like a physical reaction in my students, that there was a physical cringe or kind of, registering in some way, right, of shock or repulsion. And I started noticing that and paying more attention to that sensory response in my students and in myself. And I kept thinking about those moments that, not only in reading biblical texts, but other kinds of texts, where I'm thinking about a book, Bastard Out of Carolina by Dorothy Allison, which has one of the most horrific scenes of violence that I've ever encountered. And I remember feeling, I don't even know how to make sense. It's not I don't yet have language for it, but there was a physical sensation that I had in reading it. And, going back to that, I think, this is those moments are important ethically, right? Those moments are important in terms of meaning making. Can I say, rationally, do I have an argument about that moment in the text? I mean, I could, if I spent more time on it, I'm sure I could, come up with with an interpretation that is verbal and rational and all these things that we like. But it's also, but I'm already interpreting it, right? Before I've done that work, it's already sort of part of my way of perceiving the world. One of the key phrases that I like is from Adam Zachary Newton's book, Narrative Ethics, and which is a major influence in this book, and he talks about reading as infection, and that is a very unfortunate phrase for us in the middle, at the tail end, hopefully, of a pandemic, to think about reading as infection. We have all kinds of associations with that. But I also think it's very apt, right? That reading sort of becomes part of our sensory perception, our interpretive framework. The stories that we read, it doesn't matter if I have a conclusion about them, they're still sort of part of the way that I address the world, that I think about the world, and that I respond to the world. That becomes part of who I am.
Yeah. I was in class yesterday, and I'm teaching a class in Joshua now, and we were reading from Deuteronomy 13, where you have the harem laws directed against the community, and that's one where the violent rhetoric is so intense to read, because it goes through the people you should not pity or spare, who are idolaters, and it uses intentionally intimate language, like your very own son or daughter, or the wife you embrace. The way it rhetorically frames that it's an intense experience. And so I think you're right that even if we can't say what that does to us exactly in terms of ethical formation, it is doing something. And then you have to ask the question, like, well, what is it this text is trying to form in us by seemingly intentionally doing that?
Exactly.
It's not incidental.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So that leads me to, I want to talk briefly, but let's get into an example from Judges 5, which, it's a story. Well, maybe you could set it up for us, get the context, and then what you focused on was Sisera's mother, which is very interesting.
That story of Yael in Judges 5, it's actually in Judges 4 and 5. The narrative account in Judges 4, and then there's a retelling of the story in Judges 5, or a companion account in Judges 5 in poetry, and so the story takes place under the leadership of Deborah. Deborah and Barak go to war to free the people, and Sisera is the army commander who is fleeing from Barak. So he's not winning the war, right? He's on the run, and he goes to. He flees and encounters Yael alone in her tent. And, obviously, this is a very intense moment. There's not any insight in the text as to what Yael is thinking or perceiving, but he seeks protection from a woman who is alone. And she invites him in to her tent and kind of comforts him, offers him hospitality. And then as he rests, she puts a tent peg through his skull. And it's a dramatic story. And then it's recounted in poetry in chapter 5, and she is blessed. I mean, it is a celebration of her victory over Sisera. And, she is really celebrated. And then there's this very brief scene at the end of that poem of celebration, of commemoration of her, at the end, where you get a picture of, and this is toward the end of chapter 5, you get a picture of Sisera's mother, right? We're celebrating Yael, and there's this reiteration of the tent peg through the skull and Sisera falling at her feet, like 3 times it's referenced, it's emphasized. And then you turn very quickly to a picture of Sisera's mother at the window, looking out, right, the window, looking for her son. Where is he? And then her ladies in waiting or her companions there, right, say, well, don't worry. He's probably collecting women or wombs, right, as it is in the Hebrew, and embroidered cloths, right? So he's going to bring that back to you. And she kind of accepts that interpretation of events. And then, right, as a reader, that if Yael had been on the losing side, right, that would have been her outcome, right, that she would have been one of the wombs collected by Sisera. But of course, the reader knows that Sisera is dead, and that Yael, a woman, which would have been a humiliating death, has killed him. And so there's a really interesting sort of very sort of powerful emotional journey that you're taken through in this story, right? Because from the outset, that you are supposed to be on Yael's side. She's celebrated. And then very quickly, it's sort of like introducing a sympathetic moment with Sisera's mother. Really, it sort of throws you off, right? And then just as quickly in the next verse, you realize, well, this woman is she's a monster, right? What is she doing? She's celebrating or comforting herself by imagining her son as a victor who is, raping and pillaging Hebrew women. And that's her source of comfort, right? And that she might get some, embroidered cloths. So you get to the end of that story and you're like, okay, so I don't feel any sympathy with her. She's terrible, right? But then you're kind of brought back to, my students are always like, but what about that moment? I mean, yes, she's awful, but then why do we have to think about, why does the text kind of intentionally invite us to think about her as a anxious mother who has a son, right? And she is waiting for him to come home. It sort of humanizes, right? It humanizes her just as quickly as it dehumanizes her. Yeah.
Yeah. So what do you think that moment's doing?
Yeah. So I started thinking about that. It seems as if one of the common ways of interpreting it has been, that this is a way of mocking Sisera and the family, his people, right? That he's been killed by a woman and he kind of deserved it. I mean, look at the kind of people that he comes from, right? They're this brutal, sort of horrific woman was his mother, and he probably deserved death, right? And there is this, the way in which the text does do that, right? The text does sort of alleviate any guilt you might have in celebrating the death of Sisera. It kind of affirms that he was deserving of what he got from Yael, and it sort of mocks him, right, and his family. So I do think the text is doing that. I agree with that, but I'm also really hung up on that moment of humanization as well. I think that, rather than read that as just kind of setting the mother, kind of including the mother as a means of mocking or belittling Sisera, I think that I started to think about that as maybe they were genuinely, aware and concerned about, the fact that they were celebrating Sisera's death, and maybe they wanted to remind people that, that he is a person, right? He does have people who are mourning him, and that combination of, humanizing the enemy and dehumanizing the enemy, I thought was just really fascinating. I didn't know how to make sense of it until I started reading about moral injury. And Brad Kelly has done a lot of work on this that I've found really, really helpful. But, moral injury is this kind of the recognition that's been building for the past, I guess, decade, probably more, that people who participate in and witness acts of violence are also formed by that. They're affected by that in ways that make them question the world, the justness of the world, the rightness of the world in which they live. And, so rather than think of the authors of this text as sort of intentionally dehumanizing Sisera's mother, I started to wonder if they were wrestling themselves with the celebration that they felt about this victory, but also recognizing that in celebrating the death of someone, you are celebrating the death of a son, right? You are celebrating, in some ways, the grief of a mother. And so it started to be a significant moment on a number of levels, right? It starts to be kind of a more profound, to me, recognition of the possibility of that the Hebrew people were not, that they were wrestling with their involvement in warfare in a very complex way here. That kind of opened up possibilities for me.
Yeah, I thought that was a great analysis. And you talked about how in addressing moral injury, one of the key parts of that is humanization of the enemy. Because, I think an Israelite reading that could say, okay, so Sisera is the son of a mother who waits at her window just like we might wait for our son returning from battle. And it's just this profound moment of recognition and empathy. And like you said, that's not trying to do the work of trying to even complicate the justness of what Yael did, but by humanizing the enemy in a context of violence, which from the perspective of the writer is just violence, you're mitigating that moral injury in some way.
Yes. Yeah. In recognizing it. And, I've been very interested in reading, there's a great book called What It Is Like to Go to War by Karl Marlantes. Is a popular book by a Vietnam veteran. And, he laments the lack of rituals among veterans that recognizes the celebration of surviving war, right? That you do, that needs to be recognized, right? And one of the ways that people are prepared to go to war is by naming something or someone as an enemy, and that is part of the process. And surviving that is something that feels like it needs recognition and celebration. However, if the only way that we perceive enemies is as other, as less than, as dehumanized, then that is also damaging. It's damaging to them, clearly, right? But it's also damaging to the warrior, right? To the person who engages in that kind of dehumanization process. Everyone is dehumanized in that. And so rehumanizing is a way to remember, kind of call yourself back to your own humanity as well. And maybe that is the way that this text functions as well, right? The reader is called back to their own humanity, right? That they have to kind of remember, right? That this person is a person, that Sisera has a mother.
Right. Yeah, it made me think too of with all that's happening in Ukraine right now. It's sort of the equivalent maybe of a Ukrainian thinking about a Russian mother. And there has actually been a lot of talk about that, like trying to appeal to that reality. So, and you can see that sort of struggle with wanting to humanize the enemy, but also seeing the brutality. And how do you navigate that?
How do you navigate it in the moment? And then how do you navigate it, for us reading this text, how do we allow ourselves, how do I in 2022 think about that event and make sense of it? And the structures that are created in interpreting that are, as you note, we can think about that text and then think about it in relation to things that are happening around us today. It makes warfare not a simple us them, right, process of destruction, right? It's it's much more complicated. Everyone is touched by it.
Yeah, absolutely. Good. Well, I want to just switch gears for a moment, do a speed round. So these are quick fire questions. So what's the most significant book in biblical studies in the last 50 years?
Oh my gosh. For me, there are a couple. Phyllis Tribble, Texts of Terror, I think changed biblical studies. Not only as a feminist approach, but just the idea just recognizing that women as the objects of violence. I mean, this is just an ongoing concern, and she just sort of she mapped that for people in a new way. I think it opened up a whole path for so many scholars. So I think that was a very important book. I think War in the Hebrew Bible by Susan Neidich, I think that changed. That book, I think, is just, again, sort of shifted the field from my perception. Her interest in looking at harem, and the warfare texts, and really complicating that ideology and saying, well, warfare ideologies come in a lot of different forms in the Hebrew Bible, and really kind of making that harder, to come to conclusions about. I thought she did a really brilliant job with that. And the other book that I'll just mention is Karen Reeder's book, Enemies in the Household. And it's about laws of family violence. All of these books are about violence. I'm sure there are other important books too, but
yeah, that's a great book.
Yeah, it is. It really is. And she's really doing something. I mean, it's well written, I think, and, impeccably researched, but she's just asking just great questions. It's about, so we have these laws of family violence that are, that do violence to our notions of everything that a household should mean, right? Everything that family should mean. The idea that a parent should stone a child, right? It's just horrifying. And she says, well, yes, but what should we assume, right? Based on that, like what should we assume about the Hebrew people? That they were just, violent people who were capable of, didn't think twice about, doing violence to their children. Let's try to think about what those texts, how they functioned in their own context.
Yeah. I thought that was a great analysis.
Really sympathetic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that seems to be a theme in your work too, of empathetic, sympathetic reading of the text.
Oh, well.
Yeah.
Trying.
Yeah. And I also liked her question too, like how the frame of Deuteronomy complicates those texts, because how does Yahweh deal with Yahweh's own son, Israel? And it's not by just obliterating them at the first instance of idolatry. So that should shape our reading of those texts too. I thought that was great.
Exactly. Yeah.
Maybe you've already touched on this, and what's a book that's had the most profound impact on you as a scholar, or maybe a resource that you keep returning to?
Well, it's not a book. It's an article that Carol Newsom wrote about dialogic truth, and I'm going to forget the title of it, even though I just assigned it. I can't believe
is that Bhakti in the Bible or something like that?
Yeah. Yes. Thank you. Bhakti in the Bible. That article for me was just, it just opened up a whole new side of my brain, I think. It was one of those, that there are different kinds of truth, right? And the ways that we think about dialogue are that constitutes a kind of knowing that's valuable, a kind of intelligence that the Bible models is significant, even if it's different from, kind of a model of solitary, unitary, independent truth. Yeah.
Yeah. I still find, that idea has always challenged me. And, because I do generally operate, I think, with a monologic view of truth. So if there's a dialogue, you wouldn't know, well, which side has the better argument. And what if the Bible is, in some instances, and I don't think she would say every, but like some instances, portraying the truth of the matter as a dialogue. And that's tough to get your mind around.
The way that we talk about truth actually is part of the truth.
Yeah. What's one idea in biblical studies that you think needs to die?
I think the idea of interpretation as disembodied, I think that we need to give more attention to embodiment, both in the ways that we are embodied as interpreters, the way that the body is represented and talked about. And this has to do with notions of selfhood as well, I think. But I think we need to give more attention to our embodiment.
Good one. Just go back to your book for a moment here. What is your approach to narrative ethics? How does it foster a more complicated understanding of Samson? So I think a lot of us, he's a brute and he's part of this downward spiral in Judges. He's on the downhill slope. So what do you want to say?
Is, Yeah, and it's easy to read it that way because he is so impetuous and he doesn't seem to have any sort of self-reflection about his actions, and he just goes from scene of violence to scene of violence. I mean, it's just rapid paced acts of acts of aggression or conquest of women. So yes, absolutely, he does seem like that. And then I was just really stuck on this chapter and the introduction to his family in Judges 13, that you get this really long chapter really about his family context and what role does that play in our understanding of Samson's activities as they unfold. I think that was sort of the question that I kept thinking about, is how the narrator brings us back to context, right, and to family relationships and this strange story in Judges 13, that where Samson is not yet born, but it's, the messenger coming and telling Samson's mother that she's going to give birth to Samson, and she goes and tells Manoah, Samson's father, and he says, well, I need to hear it for myself. And, this kind of, so they go back, Manoah's wife, Samson's mother, goes back, and angel comes again, but doesn't include Manoah, and then he's like, it's like the angel and Manoah's wife both sort of have this disdain. They know they don't want to include him. It's very, it's sort of comical, really. He asked to be included, and the angel says, I told you what is going to happen. I told you what to do. Don't drink, right? You're going to give birth to a Nazarite, the special child. I mean, it's this kind of very strange avoidance of discussion with Manoah, miscommunication. And what are we to make of that, as a context for why tell that strange story as a context for understanding Samson? And that's where I think this notion of masculinity becomes important, right? Because it does seem like that story in Judges 13 is almost intentionally positing Manoah as sort of a diminished man, right? That he doesn't perform masculinity according to the ideals of masculinity, right? He's not the master of the household. He's sort of intentionally, kind of put to the side and alienated in a position of leadership, right? He's not invited to kind of take on a position of leader. And so you get to Samson, and he's just kind of constantly asserting himself, right? Whereas Manoah is rest and seems passive and sort of the diminished man. You've got Samson constantly asserting himself, constantly, kind of trying to master situations, master his body, master others' bodies, display power, rip the lion apart with his bare hands, tear things down, display his intelligence, and are these things connected, right? Became my question, how his family context shaped his need to assert himself and his masculinity, right? And this is, in fact, an ongoing kind of idea about masculinity and in gender studies is, the idea that men are sort of in this exhausting process of continually having to assert power, right, and control. And, it's a kind of hot potato situation of having to kind of toss back or deflect any sort of question or threat to one's masculinity. And what an exhausting life that must be, right? If that's the way that you consider, if that's the way that you perform masculinity, as this constant deflection of any any threat to your control and mastery. And in fact, you do see that when you come to the end of the Samson story. I mean, he's laying in Delilah's lap saying, I wish I could be like any other man, like, I'm done. This is exhausting. I just want to be like somebody else. So it sort of brings to the foreground this, these connections between constructions of masculinity and violence that I think are interesting. Again, are any conclusions made by that? I don't know. I mean, he's not a likable character. I don't feel like a lot of sympathy with Samson. And yet the narrator, I think, wants me to ask deeper questions, to ask other questions about him that kind of poke holes in my neat little, attempts to define Samson.
Yeah, and that's what I love about your book is your ability to draw out those nuanced complexities in the stories that on the surface might seem horrifically violent. And you touch on this a little bit. I was just curious to get your take on Joshua, because Joshua is another book where it's got this kind of surface, a quick read of it, conquest, extreme violence, they gain the land, success story. What are some, I don't know if you have thoughts on that, on the way that the book itself might invite a more nuanced reading?
That's a great question. I love that question. Again, if you read Joshua closely, though, even though there's this, the celebration of, conquering Jericho, for instance. I mean, that's the book that's the part of the story that most people, not necessarily scholars, but my students definitely, it's sort of like you read that story and then it's sort of like the rest of the book is not that important, right? It's like, that's the main event, right? They conquer Jericho, the walls come tumbling down. But if you continue reading, right, it's a much more complicated story than that, right? It's not done. and it's not done when you get to Judges either, right? It's still very much undone. So that whole notion of, when has the land been conquered, right?
Yeah, there are Canaanites running around all over the place when you get to Judges.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So I think that might be a way, but you would probably, that sounds like a great, project.
Yeah, well,
I
mean, it comes up in our class on Joshua, and certainly with fronting the Rahab story, it's already messing with you as a reader, and regarding these Canaanites, and in particular, a woman who's a prostitute, and kind of embodying everything Israel's supposed to avoid religiously, and
yet she saves them,
right?
Right? Yeah,
right. So that you have a section on the book of Ruth, and we don't normally associate Ruth with violence, or I think again, like as readers come to it, it's this nice story about redemption and harvesting and all kinds of like idyllic features, as you said in the book. What are we missing by moving so quickly through the book, and what do you want to say about violence in that book?
I didn't really start thinking about it as violence until I started, as a violent book, until I started teaching it. And I had a student who was studying immigration in another class, modern issues, right, from particularly related to immigration from Latin America and South America. And she'd spent a lot of time thinking about our modern discourse about immigration. And she just sort of kind of offhand mentioned, she just called Ruth and Naomi immigrants. And at that moment, I don't think that I had ever really applied that term. I just hadn't really made that connection. And it was like a lightning bolt. I thought, oh my gosh, that's right. They are immigrants, and they are, and from there, once you started thinking about, what we know today, right, about the nature of immigration, and started, thinking about the migration habits of the past, right? That this idea of a nation state, right, is with boundaries that you need passports, right, to get in and out of. I mean, this is all very new, right, in terms of human ways of organizing ourselves. And migration, this would have been a common thing, right? And so anyway, so I started thinking about what that meant, right? To think about the experience of migration, especially for two women. This is the only book that we have in the Bible that's about single women, right? Women who are not attached to men, and what that means for them. And then I started thinking about, well, it also takes place in the context of a ecological disaster, right? The famine, and what does that sort of set in motion in our thinking? So it took a while for all those pieces, because as you said, it's not the kind of violence that there's no body count, right? There's not, like when you read Judges, the Samson story, you get like numbers of people, right? That Samson killed.
1,000 with a donkey bone.
Right, exactly. This is very, it's qualitative or quantitative. So you've got, you've got a body count. And when you get to Ruth, of course, it's not direct violence. It's not on the surface. And yet, the more I started thinking about the kind of undercurrents of the story, it seemed like more attention to violence was merited, right? So and this was I think I was just listening to NPR and heard a story about Rob Nixon's book, Slow Violence and Environmentalism of the Poor. And he addresses this directly. He says, there's all kinds of violence that we can't see, that isn't spectacular, right? We tend to think about, we've been trained really, right, to think about violence as something that is kind of numerical, right? Wars have beginning and end, right? World War I begins on this date, ends on this date, right? Or, it's something that you can see. But he says, our environmental crisis that we are currently both creating and enduring, right, is slow, right? The degradation to the environment that is violence, and that we will experience as violence eventually, if we haven't already, is slow, and it will be kind of a process that is going to be difficult for us to name and see, right? And so we have to train ourselves to learn to think about registers of violence that are not direct, that are not spectacle, right? And that was useful to me. That was a useful idea to think about ways that artists and writers have developed to connect issues of instances of past violence to our present moment, for instance. That, I think, is a really important way of thinking about violence. And I think it really does help me see some aspects connect some things about Ruth that are important.
Yeah, you drew out a couple of features that I found helpful. First of all, the setting of the book, in the days the judges judged, so immediately the book is set in a violent context. And I think maybe I had read that sometimes as a sort of contrast, like as opposed to Judges, when things are violent, you have Ruth, where things are quite nice. But as you point out, when she goes to the field, she's extremely vulnerable, and that's mentioned in the text. And of course, her status as a Moabite is highlighted even when she's seemingly integrated into life in Bethlehem. So her precarity as a woman, as an immigrant foreigner, is really right under the surface. And so, the book is, I think, I forget exactly how you worded it, but it's always like about to take a violent turn.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like something's going to happen that's violent. It might happen, but it doesn't. And there's a constant, what I find now in reading it is that it's sort of like it takes you through the potential for violence that these women might encounter. They don't encounter it, but it's not, but it's like it suggests that definitely other people have encountered that violence. And, what are the various obstacles that women at this time had to overcome in order to achieve a sense of safety? And even at the end of the story, how safe are they, right? I mean, it's a text that Jack Lapsley's term whispers of the text, I think, is useful. It sort of whispers suggestions, possibilities, potential for violence that was happily avoided, right, in the story, but is also still ongoing and real.
Yeah, not to mention the threshing floor as well, where she was very vulnerable and precarious.
Very, very, yes. What does she have to do in order to survive, right?
Yeah. So, and you also have a chapter on Abigail that I'll leave for now. People have to go read it, and there's a lot more in each of these chapters that you drew out about these characters. I'm wondering, if just stepping back, what it is that you're hoping to change in conversations about violence in the Bible.
The first thing I wanted to do was kind of build on and collect the work that is going on right now and sort of categorize, how we think about violence. What's the vocabulary that we're using? Because language is a tool for seeing and perceiving, right? More about the text. And so I wanted to bring together not only the ways that biblical scholarship is handling violence currently, but also draw on work I was doing outside of biblical studies that might, like the slow violence idea, right? That might help us see more, right? So I guess the idea is seeing more, right, is important, or perceiving more is important about encounters with violence. And before we move to solutions, not that solutions are not important, but before we move to questions about action in the world that mitigates violence, which is crucially important, I hope we can also recognize the complexity of the violent systems and learn to see ourselves as part of them, as both participants in and victims of those constructions, those interpretations of the Bible, right? And use the Bible as a relational tool, both for our own sort of formation as more sensitive readers and perceivers, but also for more sensitive citizens of the world, right? And neighbors to people. So I hope there's a practical
absolutely
outcome.
And I we didn't have a chance to talk through it, but I did find that taxonomy of different kinds of violence in the beginning of the book so helpful, and then you sort of work them out in your examples throughout the book. We didn't even get to talk about like structural violence in Ruth. And,
there's so much,
many other kinds of violence. So you're expanding our vocabulary of how we think about violence, and then that in turn should make us more perceptive. So that's a real gift in this book.
Thank you.
Amy, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me here at OnScript, and all the best to you in your ongoing work.
It was such a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Yeah.
You've been listening to OnScript, delectable conversations on scripture and theology. If this episode has brought you inner peace or lit your biblical fire, please consider a small donation of just $2 or $5 per month. Information on how to donate can be found at onscript.study/donate.